settler colonialism impacts all of us. It's structural, it's cultural. So very few of us in the US are able to not participate in it. This is part of just barrier around white communities in general, that there's a belief system that settler colonialism doesn't apply to them in their lives and that they're exempt from it somehow. It's not just the job of Native peoples to recognize settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is not a Native problem. It is an everybody problem. The sooner folks can get a toehold in understanding the prevalence of settler colonialism, the sooner we can have a different starting point for conversations.
You're listening to The Underview, an exploration in the shaping of our place. My name is Mike Rush, and this is the final part of a three-part conversation with Melissa Horner. We've been discussing the historical impact of settler colonialism in the United States. And for the third part of this conversation, we're going to focus on how settler colonialism impacts all of us today. About half of this episode is the conclusion of Melissa and I's conversation. And then after Melissa and I finish our conversation, I've gone ahead and included two examples from January of this year. The first being Mike Johnson being sworn in as Speaker of the House of Representatives, and the second is from President Trump's inaugural address. I've done this because I think they provide the reality of the situation that we find ourselves in today. All right, let's jump right in. The best is yet to come. Yeah, Melissa, thank you. I think I know we could probably talk about that for days, and I think, but to just get a small understanding of how these concepts are connected, for me personally, is super, super helpful. And I know probably these examples, we're really talking about how this has impacted our larger culture today, but I don't want to move on from this without the understanding of, like, how's that impacting Indigenous communities today?
When you have a population of people that have been the targets of settler colonialism for the last 500 plus years, it creates a lot of problems in these communities, both historically and ongoing problems. So if we think about Native nations, Indigenous communities being the targets of massacres, boarding schools, land seizures, economic and governmental disruption, forced assimilation, removal and relocation programs, food source interruption, ongoing racism, we could go on and on. When that happens over and over again, over generations, over centuries, to tribes, groups, families, you get a form of what there are some Indigenous psychologists and folks who work a lot on this, but they call it intergenerational historical trauma, which is essentially a complex form of trauma that consists of cumulative emotional, psychological, physical, social, cultural wounds that have been happening to generation after generation in the same tribe, in the same family, what have you. And so from that compounded trauma that is transmitted intergenerationally, we see what are known as historical trauma responses in Native communities. And so these are when we get things like disproportionate health statistics, when we see things like Native Americans suffer from cardiometabolic diseases at higher rates than any other race, or we get these really disturbing depictions of alcoholism and addiction on Native reservations. Or we think about things like the overrepresentation of the prevalence of diabetes in Native communities. These are all historical trauma responses. These are social and physical circumstances that have been produced because these folks have been targets of ongoing traumas for so many centuries. And that is all sort of part of the harm that settler colonialism has created for Native folks, really across the whole country. I don't personally know anybody, friends, family, that haven't been affected by some of these things. And so it definitely hits close to home. And one important thing I think, too, to remember that I do want to share in this is that settler colonialism has produced a lot of challenges for Native peoples. That's undeniable. And the settler colonial project to eliminate Native people was never complete. Like, it didn't actually succeed. And so that's really important and empowering for a lot of Native people today. And a lot of Native nations and Indigenous families are really innovative and draw on our deep cultural resources, our connection to land, to continue to heal, to practice, to live well in the ways that we always have before settler colonization started disrupting our life ways 500 years ago.
I realize that the question of how settler colonialism is impacting Indigenous communities today is obviously built on what has been done. But maybe I hear a little bit of hope in your voice or in your comment, because it feels like maybe a little bit of a shift, if you will, into how maybe these communities have been portrayed for hundreds and hundreds of years. I'm curious your perspective on how we, because of this, how we have viewed Indigenous communities, maybe versus how we should be viewing them today.
Yeah, I love this framing. I think this is really important because the sort of, I would say, the mainstream social awareness of Native communities is oftentimes deficit oriented, or it centers around damage and oftentimes represents Native nations and Indigenous peoples as people who are suffering or people who have a lot of problems. Might get portrayals of extreme poverty or really poor health outcomes. Those are just some really common ones I see in the media. And some of those things are true, like I mentioned, because of the damage that settler colonialism has wrought. But what's really important to take away from this is that any time that there are these damage-centered narratives and portrayals, it's actually revealing information to us about settler colonialism, not about Indigenous people. Indigenous people still have a lot of beauty, a lot of desire, a lot of joy, a lot of health. And this is just another sort of settler colonial mechanism to portray Indigenous communities as suffering and needing to be helped, rather than as powerful and agentive in our own right.
Yeah, I feel like we could talk about that for another hour or two. I definitely want to be in a position of honoring Native communities, Indigenous communities around the beauty that is there. And I think some of the guests that we've spoken to in this season it reveals some of that information and reveals a lot of that, the beauty of culture, the beauty of people, the beauty of just the inherent dignity that everyone holds. And so I really appreciate that, to encourage us to continue to center that narrative around the beauty of people who have, yes, they have gone through great, hard things, but still are not centered in that narrative. And so thank you for the reminder of that. I'm super, super thankful for that. I want to ask this question because as we talk about settler colonialism, I know we could continue to dig into this topic. I want to understand the ongoing role of the church and maybe go back to the origin a little bit. I know in 2023, Pope Francis formally denounced settler colonialism and formally repudiated the doctrine of discovery. What does that mean today? Maybe I'll stop there. What does that mean? How should I look at this? How should I view this?
Yeah, there's a lot of folks across Native country that have really been taking this up and thinking about this, because I guess I'll start by saying it doesn't have no value. It's a recognition by the head of the Catholic Church that says what we did was wrong. It's an apology. Part of Pope Francis's formal repudiation, he said things like the Vatican acknowledges that the papal bulls that made up the Doctrine did not reflect the rights of Indigenous people. He also said that those bulls were manipulated for political purposes by colonial powers. And there's a lot of really great, I think, detailed information about how the church recognizes the purpose and the harm of the doctrine of discovery. And it's long overdue, of course. It's egregious that it took until 2023 for this renunciation to happen. But I think that your question raises thinking ahead too. And so one question for all of us that I've been chewing on myself is, okay, so the doctrine of discovery has been renounced, but what happens to all the structures and ways of being that have been put in place as a result of the doctrine of discovery? I don't know how the Pope can renounce all of those. I think that'd be very challenging to undo that. I think another question is, let me think about this.
You can say whatever you want. And you don't have to measure it at all if that's what you're considering, which I would.
I think I'm wondering too about the ways the doctrine of discovery has transferred wealth to certain people and communities and away from others. Because there are social impacts of that, of course, but also material consequences of generational wealth and the other side of that too. And ultimately, how are we as a global and national society in relationship with the intergenerational harm the doctrine of discovery has created? How will we move forward being in relationship with that harm, I think, is one of my questions. All of this doesn't go away because the Pope apologized. And so thinking about next best steps, I think, is a good way to go about this. A lot of Native folks believe the Catholic Church also needs to commit to action alongside the Pope's renunciation, that the renunciation itself isn't enough. And it's almost okay, the Vatican has these points in the sort of recognition of wrongs. And so it's okay, what kind of action might be paired with those recognition of harms done? Deborah Parker, she's Tulalip, and she's the CEO of the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. She did some of this labor for the church, and she offers 3 really practical suggestions as starting points that the church can take up. One thing she says is that the church should provide access to Catholic Indian boarding school documents to tribes. Tribes still don't have all the information about what happened to all of the kids that were taken out of our communities. The church has those documents. And so she's like, all right, give us access to these. A second suggestion she has is that the church could return boarding school lands to the tribal nations that they were originally stolen from. The church still has hundreds and hundreds of acres of land where these boarding schools were. And then the third one brings us really up to sort of policy change. There's a bipartisan bill right now with, I believe, 32 co-sponsors. It's the Truth and Healing Bill. I think the formal name is Senate Bill 1723. And so Deborah Parker requests that the Catholic Church politically supports this bill. This bill, just really in short, would establish what they're calling a Truth and Healing Commission, which would provide a platform for survivors of Indian boarding schools and their families to share their stories and experiences. And the commission would do things like conduct a comprehensive investigation, make recommendations to Congress, locate Native children that have still never been returned home, and then ultimately make a public report available. And so the Catholic Church was the major operator of Indian boarding schools in this country for about a century. And over that time, it's still unknown what a lot of the realities of those schools were. Families and tribes certainly feel the effects, and we know them well. But realities like, I believe there's about 520 known boarding schools in the US, 408 of which were directly funded by the federal government. But all those records are scattered across federal, state governments, church archives, private collections. And part of this Truth and Healing Commission would help gather and document and put resources into basically bringing together a more comprehensive picture on the full impact of this federal policy and removing Native children from their homes. And so this sort of goes into, too, another just very thing that has been with me since she's taken office. But Deb Haaland, first Native American U.S. Secretary of the Interior, she has been a big part in trying to prioritize this Truth and Healing Commission. And I don't know, of course, how this would be going if there wasn't a Laguna Pueblo woman in that office. But I have to think that since she has spoken on her lived realities and experience and knowledge of these schools, that her position has helped bring awareness and potential policy change to the federal level in the U.S. that maybe wouldn't have been happening if Deb Haaland wasn't the Secretary of the Interior right now.
It's gracious.
There's so much, Mike.
Yeah, so much. Melissa, on October 25th of this past year, President Biden made a formal apology for the U.S. government's role in the Indian boarding school policy. And I want to play some of the key remarks from that statement, and then I'd love to get your response.
As time moved on, respect for tribal sovereignty evaporated, was shattered, pushing Native people off their homelands, denying their humanity and their rights, targeting children to cut their connection to their ancestors and their heritage. At first, in the 1800s, the effort was voluntary, asking tribes to send their children away to vocational schools. But then the federal government mandated the removal of children from their families and tribes, launching what's called the Federal Indian Boarding School era. Over a 150-year span, 150 years, from the early 1800s to 1970, one of the most horrific chapters in American history. We should be ashamed. A chapter that most Americans don't know about. The vast majority don't even know about it. The policy continued even after the Civil Rights Act, which got me involved in politics as a young man, even after the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. It continued. All told, hundreds and hundreds of federal Indian boarding schools across the country. Tens of thousands of Native children entered the system. Nearly 1,000 documented Native child deaths, though the real number is likely to be much, much higher. Lost generations, culture and language, lost trust. It's horribly, horribly wrong. It's a sin on our soul. After 150 years, the United States government eventually stopped the program. But the federal government has never formally apologized for what happened until today. I formally apologize as President of the United States of America for what we did. I formally apologize. But just because history is silent doesn't mean it didn't take place. It did take place. While darkness can hide much, it erases nothing. It erases nothing. Some injustices are heinous, horrific, and grievous. They can't be buried, no matter how hard people try. As I've said throughout my presidency, we must know the good, the bad, the truth of who we are as a nation. That's what great nations do. We're a great nation. We're the greatest of nations. We do not erase history. We make history. We learn from history. And we remember so we can heal.
I'd love your thoughts on that apology. Maybe you can help us, like, how do we think about this?
Yeah, I really appreciate this question. It really was a sort of landmark thing that has happened. And so Across Indian country, just meaning the various Native individuals, communities, organizations, and nations, there have been a lot of different responses to President Biden's apology. And so I'm thinking that rather than just share my own perspective, I'm going to give a flavor of the spectrum of responses that I have been bearing witness to folks talking about. I know some folks who were actually invited to the apology who are descendants of boarding school survivors. I also know other people who work really closely with living boarding school survivors. And in both of these cases, I've heard from these people that the apology was impactful for them. They finally felt seen and known in the atrocities and the traumas that they and their families experienced at the hands of the federal government, religious institutions, and in these schools. And the US government finally acknowledged that the boarding school system was designed for the purpose of taking 60-some thousand Native children as a way to damage and eliminate Native culture, language, food, so many more things. And really, this is the government acknowledging that these schools were mechanisms of cultural genocide. And so many of these survivors and descendants of survivors really want to be able to just take in this apology for as long as feels necessary for them. The apology matters for them and for all the relatives who were subjected to this kind of really gross mistreatment that boarding schools imposed on our communities and our families. And so that's one thing that has been going on since the apology that feels just really important. And then there are other Native folks I know who are less interested, less able for a variety of reasons to stay in the space of taking in the apology. And those folks have been really quick to state that this apology, similar to the Pope's denunciation of the doctrine of discovery, doesn't have much meaning unless it's also attached to action that the federal government is able to commit to. So action that helps heal the ongoing intergenerational historical trauma of boarding school harms, or action that supports tribal sovereignty, action that returns children who died at these schools home to their lands and their people. And those are some kind of short lists of action. But again, like the renunciation of the doctrine of discovery, there are Native organizations and nations who have already done the labor of gathering the next steps of what the United States could do in terms of action. I'm thinking about one in particular, the Indian Collective, and that's spelled NDN. Indian Collective is an Indigenous-led national organization dedicated to building Indigenous power across many levels of society. And shortly after the apology, they released a list of actions that they are formally requesting that the federal government pair with the apology. And like I said, it's a list, but I'll just share a couple right now. One thing they're asking is that the federal government immediately invests in Indigenous language and cultural revitalization programs as a way to support and really counter the harm that boarding schools did to Indigenous languages and cultures. Another thing that they have on their list is they want the federal government to rescind all medals of honor that were awarded to U.S. soldiers at the massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890. And I'm sure some folks are familiar with this, but just in short, the Wounded Knee massacre, 300 Lakota people, mostly women and children, were murdered by the U.S. cavalry after they surrendered. And the Indian Collective does a really thorough job thinking about how this kind of physical genocide in the form of a massacre is also linked to the cultural genocide of boarding school. And so that's why something like that is on the list, because they're trying to make sure action on the part of the federal government really understands and spans the ways that settler colonialism has been operating in this country. And so those are just some of the ways I think action can be paired with an official apology like this. But there are, of course, many ways to think about what kind of action makes an apology meaningful, and what kinds of action helps repair damage and pain that has been caused. And I think one other thing that I'll just say is it's also important, I think, to recognize that this presidential apology didn't come out of nowhere. President Biden didn't wake up on October 25th and was like, oh, I think that I should apologize for all of the atrocities the federal government did in these ways. There have been many Indigenous people, nations, organizations that have been educating those in positions of power in the US government who have been doing grassroots organizing to raise awareness around these things. And so I mentioned it earlier, but the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, they're one, Indian Collective, of course. And then there's another one, the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. And so that's just a very small slice of the Native folks who were really behind the apology and making it come to fruition.
Thank you. I think that helps give a longer view of what that day meant and means, and maybe expectations from there. Now the reality is we're in an era of a completely different administration. Do you have ideas on what that is going to look like? Expecting probably a different policy approach to the Department of the Interior and how the U.S. government relates with Native peoples. What are your thoughts now? Does it matter, given that maybe the Trump administration is going to take a different approach?
Yeah, this is something I know I've certainly been thinking about, and I doubt that I'm alone in that. I'll say a few things about it. The first is just, I think with any change in administration at the federal level, one thing that frequently gets lost that I've heard folks talk about who, work in policy spaces is that it can hinder some momentum for any number of issues, of course. And so by just thinking about this apology, it is unfortunate that there likely won't be continuity with this particular administration since have a new president. And also, Deb Haaland likely won't be the Secretary of the Interior anymore. And she's been really instrumental in a lot of these movements that have been going on for decades. But having a Native woman in that position has helped move things along. And we aren't going to be able to rely on that moving forward in terms of thinking about what kinds of action might be paired with an apology like this. And I think the second thing I'll say is just that since Biden gave this apology as president of the United States, it stands that the federal government apologized for this. That wasn't Biden acting as an individual. He is the president. And so the things that he does are on behalf of the United States government. And so I carry that with me, that I'm like, it doesn't really matter who the next president is in some ways, because that stands, that happened. We now can build off of that. And in thinking about that too, there have been so many different people running the United States government since the onset of colonization that it also just reminds me that Native people will keep doing this work regardless who occupies these offices in this settler colonial government. And if I think about the new administration and what they may or may not have capacity or understanding to be able to do to move some of this forward, I don't know that, but I do know that I have full confidence in the Indigenous peoples and Native nations who will continue to tirelessly work on this and create movement around healing and revitalization and all of the things that are connected to action on the heels of this apology.
All right. Thank you very much. I think that's it's a wise word. So thank you very much for that. I've opened something I don't know how to, not that I want to put it back in that I've opened something that is, I think trying to put it into something that people can take away and but I'm fine. I'm fine to blow it all apart too, in many ways. Like, I'm not afraid of that. So the way I end most conversations is I ask two questions. One, I ask about what are your fears for this? And then the other question that I ask is about what does wholeness look like? Fears, I think, is a relevant question. Wholeness, asking you a question about wholeness scares the hell out of me, if I'm honest. I would like to ask you that question, but you're also welcome to throw it back in my face and say, how dare you ask that question? And that would be appropriate response. I want to clear, and it'd be okay for you to say that, because the question that I think part of what we're trying to always work through is this idea of repair. Mm-hmm. One of the conversations that I had with Betty Gadke, who's a member of the Quapaw Nation tribal elder, I asked her, what does repair look like? And she was very clear. She said, you can't repair it, right? It cannot be whole in many ways. But the question really baked into that is also around what would you ask of a society today as a practical, maybe real next step? I'm going to ask people to go, obviously, do your teach out for further education, but I think that's the root of it. If you're okay, I would like to ask you those questions, unless you tell me to go take a hike.
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
Is that okay?
Bring it on. Yep.
Yeah. And you can say whatever you want. You can just hang up too. Like, I don't want you to do that. No, I don't want you to do that. But I don't take lightly what I'm asking in that area. I do and cannot comprehend or really even understand the impact of repudiation of the doctrine of discovery, or all of the things, all the tentacles, all of the places where that goes, and the work that to me feels an incredible amount of work still is to be done. I ask this question to all of our guests. I ask people what their fears are, because I do want to normalize the fact that we all have fears within the work that we do or the space that we have. And so I will defer to you how you want to answer that, if you want to answer that. But within this work, I would love to understand, what are your fears?
I think that one of the ways I am just sitting with this question is thinking about what kind of information my fears might offer me. And one of the things that came up pretty immediately when you asked this question is a fear around folks feeling like this is either too big to take on and sit with, or that it doesn't apply to them or relate to their life, or trying to take it up too fast and not sitting slowly and deeply with this massive social structure that affects all of our lives. And so that's just a handful of fears that came up right away. And I think underneath some of those is really a fear that myself and other Indigenous people I know and love will have to keep doing this by ourselves. And it's hard. This work is really hard to do. The learning and healing and trying to collaborate to create change is a massive effort. And for Native people, it is so connected to our beings and our families and our home places that we also have to wade through all of the emotional experiences that come up, all of the pain and trauma. And so doing work like this is a lot easier when there is more people doing it. And so some of that too, I think, relates to maybe just a more general fear that people won't be able to feel like they can contribute to a sort of resistance of settler colonialism or an awareness building of settler colonialism. And one person that I really admire in helping me think about this, his name is Dean Spade. He's an organizer and teacher and lawyer. And he has this framework. It's a 3-part framework that's actually very basic, but it has helped me. And so I want to share about it too, because it helps assuage some of my fears when I'm like, oh no, how are we going to do this? This is massive. What are we going to do? And Dean Spade has this framework to help us think about social change, to maybe move us into less colonial and more livable futures for all of us. And so he has this tripart framework that tries to honor different ways different people can contribute to a project, like thinking through how settler colonialism might be replaced or how might we move away from it. And so the first part of that is Spade says that some people who are working on this can try to dismantle the harmful system, or at the very least prevent their expansion. And so this might be like a question like, how do we get rid of settler colonial media or education or healthcare systems, something like that. He says a second part that some people can be working on is directly providing for people who are targeted by settler colonial systems and institutions. And so this is in the space of the everyday. People are harmed every day by ongoing settler colonialism, whether that's due to a lack of housing or a lack of healthcare, any number of things, of course. And so this has a question attached to it that's, while macro work is being done at a systemic level, how do we collectively care for and support one another and the daily needs of people who are suffering under this system that creates a lot of pain? And then the third one is Spade suggests that the rest of some of us can be working on building alternative infrastructures through which people can get their needs met and more, hopefully. And a question that I often think about with this part is, how can we also think alongside Indigenous leadership to consider what alternative infrastructures might look like? Indigenous peoples have maps, memories, knowledge for ways of being and knowing that were here before settler colonialism was. And so they're always a good source of knowledge to follow the lead of.
I think you're actually, in my opinion, it's like the next question that I always ask people is this question of what does wholeness look like? And it feels like even in that response to fear, you're moving towards what does wholeness potentially look like? And so I don't take lightly that question as I ask that to you, given the conversation and the history that we've been discussing, but maybe to lean into that a little bit more, what could wholeness look like, or what does wholeness look like within this conversation?
I think one thing that for me, it doesn't look like is perfection. Like, in order to become more aware and work on any number of these issues from wherever we're at, it doesn't have to be something that's perfect. Settler colonialism and the impacts of it in all of our daily lives, it is complicated. It's not neat and tidy. So neither are any of the solutions or paths that we might involve ourselves in. I think part of it is this idea, and I think I mentioned this to you a long time ago, but this idea of being part of a mess that has been created in this country. I think that's part of the wholeness, is being in the mess of it, all knowing that we're connected to people who have already been working on this for a long time, connected to people who will continue to make this world more livable after our parts are over. And it's slow. It took over 500 years to build these settler colonial structures. And so I think, too, part of the wholeness is the allowance that, I know for me at least, I often find that thinking and feeling through settler colonialism can be empowering and it can be overwhelming all at the same time. And it is messy and it's complex because so many of our identities and our relatives and our home places, the things we care about, are entangled in settler colonialism, which can make it feel really hard to be in while also trying to analyze it and counter it in whatever ways feel right in our lives. And the reality is most of us are contributing to ongoing colonialism and being impacted by it in various ways. And we don't have to pick between those things. Like, we can acknowledge that both of those things are true for many of us, and that can help shape how we want to move forward individually and collectively. And so I think my hope in the wholeness is that if we can allow space for all of this to simultaneously exist, then we can collectively feel more equipped to recognize, describe, respond to ongoing settler colonialism in our own lives and alongside others that are also interested in moving forward in ways that are not burdened by ongoing colonialism.
One of the things that we have talked about is the differences between different groups of people. I'll just say white communities. I would like to understand, because of the ongoing effects of settler colonialism and how that impacts the perpetrator as well as those who have been affected by it. I'm curious, what do you view as the challenges for white communities to change their understanding, their historical understanding, and really how settler colonialism has influenced the way we live and the way we think about our world today?
Yeah, so this is one that I really try to have pretty deep conversations with students in my classes about. A lot of students come into my classes interested in various ways, but they're interested in learning about settler colonialism in terms of Indigenous peoples. That's part of the reason they're there. But what they don't come in with most of the time is the recognition that settler colonialism impacts all of us. It's structural, it's cultural. So very few of us in the US are able to not participate in it. And so this is part of, I would say, a just barrier around white communities in general, that there's a belief system that settler colonialism doesn't apply to them in their lives and that they're exempt from it somehow, including the privileges as well as the harms, depending on any number of social realities that people experience. And so in this is that it's not just the job of Native peoples to recognize settler colonialism and to do something about it. Settler colonialism is not a Native problem. It is an everybody problem. And so the sooner folks can get a toehold in understanding the prevalence of settler colonialism and how it does impact everybody, the sooner we can have a different starting point for conversations.
I think all of our conversation, my hope that we can walk away from this is an understanding within white communities about its impact on us. And I think we talked about this a little bit earlier, just in the use the term vacancy too, as well. Just this idea that I am impacted by it, while not the victim of it. It does impact me in ways that are not helpful to understandings of place and belonging and my relationality to the world and to other people around us. And so I think I 100% agree. All of my words are just to say I agree with you. And so
absolutely.
There are literally no words to express just my gratitude to you. You have been unbelievably kind and unbelievably generous with your time and your knowledge. And I'm incredibly thankful for all the work that you are doing, for you bearing with me to try to allow me to step into this space of trying to better understand our structures and our systems, to understand myself. And I guess my hope in all of this is that these messages can be carried forward into our lives, into our everyday lives, about how settler colonialism is impacting us, how it has impacted us, and that we do not have this limited way of being, that we do have permission to step into our worlds, to think about things differently in a way that can remove and stop the effects of how colonialism has impacted and is impacting us today. And so, Melissa, thank you for your time and thank you for who you are and the work you're doing. Please do not stop. The world needs it. I need it. We all need it. And so just thank you for everything that you've done. And thank you for sitting and sharing all of your knowledge with us. It's been incredibly humbling and incredibly fulfilling and incredibly overwhelming and incredibly empowering all at the same time. And so thank you so much.
So well said, Mike. Thank you, Miigwech. I so appreciate being able to visit with you about this. And I know this conversation will be in relationship to the other conversations during this season. And so I feel really grateful for that as well. And I'll leave by saying Gigawabamin. That's a word in Anishinaabe-Moin. We have no word for goodbye. And so Gigawabamin means I will certainly see you again.
You may have to change your phone number or something so that Because I can tell you based on this, we're going to have a lot more questions. But Melissa, thank you. I am incredibly grateful and incredibly humbled to have spent this time with you. And yes, I have great now obligation to make sure that everybody in the world can listen to this. And so thank you, Melissa, for your time. I feel like I can only repeat what I said earlier, that there is no way to adequately say thank you for all of Melissa's wisdom, her time, and her investment into this conversation, to be a guide to us as we try to understand how these structures, institutions, and ideologies of colonialism have shaped not only Northwest Arkansas, but our state and our nation. Melissa, thank you for your voice, for being a truth teller, and being the newest addition to my hero list. I look forward to congratulating Melissa as she completes her PhD and addressing her by a title that she already deserves in my mind. And I think her newly formed fan club here in Northwest Arkansas would also agree with me. To the future Dr. Horner, I would simply return to you, Miigwech, Gigawabamin. At the beginning of this conversation, I shared a story about two young fish. And if you remember, the story goes something like this. Two young fish were swimming along when they encountered an older fish. And the older fish said, "Hey guys, how's the water today?" And the younger fish looked at each other and asked, "What is water?" So before we close this episode, I want to share two more sound bites to see if maybe we can answer our own question about recognizing the water that we swim in. These are two sound bites from our national dialogue. And I know this is a conversation about the story of Northwest Arkansas, but how we got here today is part of the story of our nation, and we can't remove ourselves from that. To understand our story, we first have to understand our nation's story. And so I want to share these two quotes because I feel like they demonstrate with abundant clarity how this topic of settler colonialism is not only a historical event, but an ongoing force in our nation today. The first quote that you'll hear is from January of this year, when Congressman Mike Johnson of Louisiana was elected the 56th Speaker of the House of Representatives. I want to play his comments after he was sworn in as the Speaker and simply ask you to filter them through everything that you've heard from Melissa over these past 3 episodes.
When I first took this gavel, many of you heard me say that I don't believe in luck or consequence. I believe in the idea of providence. This morning, I participated with many of you early this morning in the 119th Congress Interfaith Prayer Service. It was held at St. Peter's Catholic Church. Many of you were there. It was an ecumenical service and a bipartisan service, which was great. My good friend Hakeem Jeffries began by reading with the Old Testament. He read out of Deuteronomy 10. And then I was asked to provide a prayer for the nation. I offered one that is quite familiar to historians and probably many of us. It said right here in the program, it says right under my name, "It is said each day of his 8 years of the presidency and every day thereafter until his death, President Thomas Jefferson recited this prayer." I wanted to share it with you here at the end of my remarks, not as a prayer per se right now, but as a reminder of what our third president and the primary author of the Declaration of Independence thought was so important that it should be a daily recitation. Let me just read you that prayer. It goes like this. Thomas Jefferson's Prayer for the Nation, it's entitled. "Almighty God, who has given us this good land for our heritage, we humbly beseech thee that we may always prove ourselves a people mindful of thy favor and glad to do thy will. Bless our land with honorable ministry, sound learning, and pure manners. Save us from violence, discord, and confusion, from pride and arrogance, and from every evil way. Defend our liberties and fashion into one united people the multitude brought hither out of many kindreds and tongues. Endow with thy spirit of wisdom those whom in thy name we entrust the authority of government, that there may be justice and peace at home, and that through obedience to thy law we may show forth thy praise among the nations of the earth. In time of prosperity, fill our hearts with thankfulness, and in the day of trouble, suffer not our trust in thee to fail, of which we ask through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen." That was Thomas Jefferson's prayer. Yeah. Suffer not our trust in thee to fail. We will not fail. We cannot fail. We are all in this together. Our nation is counting on us to band together and solve these problems and get this done. I've said before that I believe God has elevated each one of you, that's my belief, to your positions of leadership. And it's an act of providence that you've all been placed in your specific roles in this specific moment at this historic time, at the 250-year inflection point of the greatest nation in the history of the world. It is no small thing. We're also witnesses to the providence that spared our incoming president, President Trump, from the assassin's bullet, remarkable as that was, and to the new coalition of Americans that has risen from every creed, color, and cul-de-sac who want us to put America first. Our people are asking for a thriving economy and a rebuilt middle class and strong borders and a strong military, and we can deliver that. See, these objectives and these aims don't have an R or a D behind them. They have a USA. That's what we're about.
And then the next quote that I want to share with you is from Donald Trump's presidential inauguration address. In it, I believe that we can see clearly another example of how settler colonialism is a current, real, and present-day ideology that will set the course for the foreseeable future.
Over the past 8 years, I have been tested and challenged more than any president in our 250-year history, and I've learned a lot along the way. The journey to reclaim our republic has not been an easy one, that I can tell you. Those who wish to stop our cause have tried to take my freedom and indeed to take my life. Just a few months ago in a beautiful Pennsylvania field, an assassin's bullet ripped through my ear. But I felt then, and believe even more so now, that my life was saved for a reason. I was saved by God to make America great again. America will reclaim its rightful place as the greatest, most powerful, most respected nation on earth, inspiring the awe and admiration of the entire world. Above all, my message to Americans today is that it is time for us to once again act with courage, vigor, and the vitality of history's greatest civilization. So as we liberate our nation, we will lead it to new heights of victory and success. We will not be deterred. The United States will once again consider itself a growing nation, one that increases our wealth, expands our territory, builds our cities, raises our expectations, and carries our flag into new and beautiful horizons. And we will pursue our manifest destiny into the stars, launching American astronauts to plant the stars and stripes on the planet Mars. Americans are explorers, builders, innovators, entrepreneurs, and pioneers. The spirit of the frontier is written into our hearts. The call of the next great adventure resounds from within our souls. Our American ancestors turned a small group of colonies on the edge of a vast continent into a mighty republic of the most extraordinary citizens on earth. No one comes close. Americans pushed thousands of miles through a rugged land of untamed wilderness. They crossed deserts, scaled mountains, braved untold dangers, won the Wild West, ended slavery, rescued millions from tyranny.
Well, as you work through the layers of these comments, can you see how settler colonialism is alive and well in these United States? I shared these two quotes because I believe that they show how our founding ideologies are still very much a part of what is continuing to shape our nation and thereby will continue to shape our state. So where do we go from here? What should our next steps be? I want to return to something that Melissa spoke about in her response to my question about fear when she said this.
And I think underneath some of those is really a fear that myself and other Indigenous people I know and love will have to keep doing this by ourselves.
My greatest hope is that this would not be true. So I want to ask you to participate in what it looks like to work towards a societal framework based first in relationality. And if you don't know where to begin, or even if you do, I want to ask you to take Melissa's free online course titled Ongoing U.S. Settler Colonialism and Native Peoples Teach Out. This is a comprehensive deep dive into settler colonialism that highlights perspectives from Indigenous people and nations while focusing on examples of ongoing settler colonialism as it shows up in our education, law, food systems, media, land, gender, race, ethnicity, health, medicine, and the list goes on and on. And through the course's framework, which includes Native perspectives and knowledge, those who take this course will better understand ongoing settler colonialism while being able to reimagine anti-colonial processes in the United States as a way to co-create a thriving future for everyone. And if you would hope for relationality to be the founding framework of our community, this is one of the very best places to begin. I've gone through it, and it was incredibly life-giving for me. And to help, if you visit the episode webpage, I put a link to Melissa's online course in settler colonialism. And so from here, our path will take on a new depth, because we're going to spend some time in the next couple episodes hearing directly from elders of the Quapaw Nation, of whom the state of Arkansas owes its name. We will hear their stories, their voices, their concerns, their pains, and above all, their pride and joy at being who they are in this world. Our next episode's guest is Betty Gadke. She's a Quapaw Nation elder who is reclaiming her Quapaw heritage, not only for herself, but for her nation.
It's amazing to be a Quapaw. It's one of the proudest things that I wear, actually. I look at Arkansas as my home.
Yeah.
I don't look at Oklahoma as my home. I want to go back to where we really thrived, and that would be East Arkansas. The Quapaw people are very resilient. People just keep thinking that we're gone, and we just will not disappear. We're still here, and we're strong. We keep coming back.
Well, I can't wait to share these next episodes with you, because these are the voices that are not only our guides, but they are the voices of wisdom and resilience. Until then, I want to say thank you for being an incredible and critical part in the shaping of our community as we look towards building a community based on relationality. Again, thank you. This is The Underview, an exploration in the shaping of our place.